All right. Well, we got to switch up today. Sean Finnegan, who normally hosts Restitutio, is not feeling well today. So I'm filling in, and we're having a conversation with Sam. And Sam is someone who holds more of a theistic evolutionary view. And so, what we've been doing, what Sean Finnegan and I have been doing, is going through my class. I'm Will Barlow, my class on Scripture and Science, um, through Restitutio, and the most recent three episodes was on the topic of biochemistry and evolution. And so I thought it'd be fun to bring in Sam because Sam has a different perspective on this than I do. And one of the things that we've been talking about, what I've been talking about throughout the class, is the importance of seeing different perspectives and understanding that Christians come from all different perspectives and all walks of life. And we all have different biases and different ways that we look at the world. And so it's important to grab a catalog of all the different options out there for evangelism, for reaching out to people outside the faith, but also people internally, so that we can have these conversations and have them in good faith and respectfully. And so that's what will happen today, I know, with Sam. So Sam, welcome to Restitutio. It's good to have you.
Well, thank you. So I'm glad we get to hijack Sean's show now and talk about whatever it is that we want.
Exactly.
I'm sad he can't be here, but I'm looking forward to this discussion. I also just want to say I've really been enjoying your science and faith series and enjoying you and Sean talking about this. I really appreciate the openness to the subject that you're bringing. And I really feel like this is a subject that Christians should talk about, should think about, and that we should be able to explore these topics together, and instead of having it be something too off limits or too taboo to talk and think about. So I really appreciate your approach to the subject, and I'm excited to be here.
Well, thanks. Yes, Sean says on his podcast, the truth has nothing to fear. So why can't we
Amen.
have these conversations? So why don't we start with you a little bit? Tell us a little bit about yourself for those that haven't come into contact with Sam, and then what
Sure.
made you interested about this topic, evolution specifically?
Sure. So I should say I've told my story on Restitutio before. I forget what episode number it is, but there's Sam excommunicated for his beliefs or something like that, where I talk a fair amount about my story. So if you want a fuller version of my story, especially as it relates to the Trinity and being excommunicated for not being a Trinitarian and that sort of stuff, I would point people to that episode, and I'll try not to repeat myself too much. But I'll talk about specifically the parts of my story that are most relevant for the evolution question. So honestly, sometimes when I hang out with Will and Sean, I feel like we all have extremely bizarrely parallel stories. I grew up in a offshoot of the Way International in the Chicago area. So in a X-Way fellowship. Although my group had formed, I believe, before I was born, so I was never participated in the Way itself, but nevertheless, many of the same beliefs and practices and ideas were carried over. So I was taught a very taught how important it was to believe in creationism as something that was specifically set against secular ideas and scientific ideas of evolution. And it was framed as that was sort of a godless alternative or an anti-Christian alternative. And one of the distinctives about being a Christian is not believing that, but believing creationism. And specifically, I think we grew up being taught more or less the same sort of kind of gap theory-ish, kind of old Earth, but then a very pretty, probably specifically literal 6 days of creation. And that sort of, the earth became without form and void, so maybe dinosaurs and other sorts of things were some prior epoch, I guess, that is not specifically talked about in detail in Genesis. And then there's sort of a current epoch that begins with sort of verse 2, I guess you could say, of the Bible. And that was specifically the form of creationism that we taught growing up. I assume very similar to you, Will, very similar to Sean, probably similar to a lot of listeners who might have a Way background, that sort of thing. But I was a very, scientifically and mathematically curious kid, probably very similar to you and Sean. But I remember getting really into intelligent design stuff in high school, like reading Michael Behe and those sorts of intelligent design authors. And I was the pesky kid who would ask his public high school biology teacher tricky questions to try and catch him and try and make evolution look silly in front of the whole class. So it's not like, so I should say there were periods of my time where it wasn't just that I, absorbed kind of the way or former ways, teachings on this. I kind of enthusiastically was curious about the subject myself, and was sort of a pretty, not rabid, but avid intelligent design person. I remember in high school one time, in high school biology class, we were learning about the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is like part of the cellular level of your metabolism that takes basically sugars and alcohols and rotates it in a cycle of chemicals to generate energy for your cells. And I asked a question, so how could the Krebs cycle evolve? And he's like, well, it would evolve step by step. But I'm like, but the first step of the process needs the input from the last step of the process. So if it's a 7-step process, how could you evolve step by step? Because you need the 7th step to do the first step again. And you couldn't answer that question. I felt pretty proud of myself. And
you sound like Behe, right? You sound like Behe. Yeah.
There's an irreducibly complex metabolism cycle inside a cell or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't want to, it wasn't just that I absorbed what I was taught in church. I like actually actively cared about this subject, right?
Right.
So then I go to college. I went to Cornell University in upstate New York, a Ivy League school. I was a biostatistics major, or actually Cornell calls it biometry and statistics, because Cornell's weird and has to have a unique name for all of its stuff that no one else uses. But I chose that major because I'm like, well, I like math, but I like science. And so, and I don't tend to like physics nearly as much as I like biology. So how do you do biology and math and biometry and statistics? I looked in the major catalog and I'm like, hey, that one sounds interesting. I'll put that one on my application. And honestly, I'm glad I did. If I could go back in time, I would pick the same major over again, even though I had no idea really what it was. So that meant I had to take a lot of biology classes, a lot of genetics classes, a lot of statistics classes, a lot of biostatistics classes, all of those sorts of things in college. And I would say it was becoming increasingly hard for me to resist the overall compellingness of the evidence for evolution as I was studying it and confronting it. And a lot of the objections that I might have had were eroding away, and a lot of questions that I couldn't explain otherwise were coming up, would be one way of putting it. I was also in a Christian fellowship in college, the Navigators, although I ended up getting kicked out of that for non-Trinitarian reasons. But again, see the other episode for that fuller story. But I would say that I was getting increasingly driven to something like a crisis of faith or an irreconcilable doubt, that because I had always been taught that believing in evolution and Christianity were mutually exclusively opposed options, that evolution was looking increasingly credible. I sort of was taking that, well, then Christianity must look increasingly non-credible by contrast. And then I think that probably one of the biggest and most important things is that I had some Christian friends in college whose faith I sincerely respected, right? They had a wonderful walk with God. I learned lots of things from them. I was in Bible study with them. I saw what kind of people they were, right? I really admired their faith. And then I would learn that they believed in evolution. And I was like, what, you're a black swan, that's an oxymoron. What do you mean? Right. And I had never really known that Christians could combine those two sorts of things. And I actually think probably more so than any of the evidence, maybe scientifically speaking, that convinced me to believe in evolution was the example of some people I admired and respected who were Christians and believed in evolution too. And that sort of helped smooth over my transition to accepting that idea, I would say. But it's not like there weren't questions that were left hanging from that process, or like
Mm,
suddenly everything made sense, or suddenly I could give an answer for how every single last, verse and grammatical clause in the book of Genesis could be interpreted in this new
right.
light. It like solved some questions and some sources of tension, but it also brought up different ones too, I would
Mhm.
say. And that was right around, say, the ages of 19 and 20 that I was kind of going through that process. And part of the reason why I'm excited to talk to you, part of the reason why I'm excited to share my story, is that I don't want other Christians to be in the situation where I was in,
Mhm.
where it seemed like evolution was becoming increasingly credible, and there was this belief that that it was mutually exclusive with Christianity, or necessitated believing in atheism or something like that.
Right.
But that if I can be the sort of friend that I had back in that time, of a Christian whose example you admire, that believes in this sort of thing, that if that can help people from deconstructing their faith, or feeling like they have to choose between science and faith, or that sort of thing, if I can help be that sort of bridge that other people were to me, I would find that to be a good thing and a good use of this time.
Absolutely. No, I think it's what I'm excited about this conversation as well. And I think evolution's a loaded term. And so I think my first big question for you is describing a little bit what you mean by evolution, because the people that I'm interacting with in the class, I basically have Richard Dawkins I put up as like, here's an atheistic evolutionist, and I've got Francis Collins, who's a theistic evolutionist. And their views on evolution, although very similar, I would say, are different, and there are notable differences. So if you would just describe sort of your personal take on your understanding of evolution and how it might differ from a non-theistic form of evolution.
Sure. I think that part of the problem is that atheists, or at least non-Christians, have overloaded the theory of evolution with things that might be described as metaphysical assumptions, or even sort
Mhm.
of something like a theology to it that is directly incompatible with Christian theology, but is nevertheless not necessarily supported by the science of evolution itself.
Right.
Right? The idea that if evolution is true, there is no creator. I don't think that I don't think that that follows. The
Right.
idea that if evolution is true, then everything is meaningless and random. I don't think that that follows. The idea that it's unguided as opposed to guided, well, we can get into exactly what guided might mean, but I think that that's also a false dichotomy. So I think that part of the reason why Christians feel that evolution is such an affront to their faith is that evolution has been packaged with some metaphysical, non-scientific assumptions and worldview claims that are incompatible with faith, but are not required to believe in evolution, right? So I fully realize that problem. And part of becoming, I would say, if you're a Christian who doesn't believe in evolution, and then like becomes a Christian who does believe in evolution, I feel like part of what needs to be done is you need to deconstruct some of the popular conceptions of what evolution means, that are not required to believe in the theory of evolution, but are competing theological claims to Christianity's theological claims. So I totally get that that's a big part of this clash, and that's something that hopefully I can diffuse and deconstruct a little bit in our conversation today. So I would say, what does it mean to believe in evolution? I think that what it means to me, sort of basically, is that all life shares common descent, and I'll even maybe loosen that to most life, right?
Yeah.
It shares common descent. That is, that everything that's alive, if you go far enough back in their family tree, will share ancestors, right? Just like you can imagine all humans, you can go far enough back in time for
Right.
a common human ancestor. Well, you can go far enough back in time for the ancestor of all trees, right? Or the ancestor of all mammals, the ancestor of all fungus, right? And then even fungus, trees, and animals will share a common ancestor back far enough ago. So the idea that all of life can be accounted for, or at least most of life, I'll say, through the process of common descent is one of the core things that I mean when I say evolution. And then another part of it is that the idea that things give things bring forth according to their kind. Children look like their parents, but there are differences, and there are various inheritance mechanisms. Obviously, genetics is a lot of it, but I think sometimes one of the things that I would push back on, especially for like Richard Dawkins style evolutionary theorists, and this is not unique to me, a fair amount of other evolutionary theorists, criticize Richard Dawkins for this. And one thing that also needs to be noted, there's actually a lot of diversity in, like, as any scientific discipline that is actually active and not dead has. There's diversity of opinion. I'm sure among physicists, there's a lot of diversity of opinion of how to, say, reconcile quantum physics and gravity, right? That's a subject that you can get a lot of different opinions about. It doesn't mean that physics is wrong because there's a diversity of opinion. It means that there are active ongoing research areas and that it doesn't know everything that it seeks to know yet. If it knew everything it sought to know, then it would be a dead discipline. There would be no reason to be a scientist. You would just learn the history of the discipline, and then you'd be all, right. So evolution, just like any other active scientific discipline, has a fair amount of diversity of opinion and active areas of disagreement and active areas of research and growth, right? That's what it means to be a scientific discipline. And so I think that one of the things is that genetics is often overplayed, I would say, especially in some sort of neo-Darwinists like Richard Dawkins, as being the main show. It's all about genes. And that genes are obviously very important, and the genetic revolution that sort of started in the 50s and continues to this day has reshaped the scientific field quite a bit. But there are other forms of inheritance too. There's sort of epigenetics, which is sort of like how genetics gets translated and when. And then there's increasing understanding that things like culture are extremely important forms of inheritance that get passed down from parents to future generations. It's especially important for humans, but not just humans, right? Dolphins, chimpanzees, all sorts of other animals show sets of behaviors that are not encoded in their DNA that they learn from the previous generations as a form of, like, it's like transmitted by memory and imitation, not through genetics. So there are multiple forms of inheritance that cause children to be like their parents. Genetics is a big one, but it's not the only show in town. So anyway, so that's part of the idea. Children look like their parents, but they're not identical to their parents. And that these variations give rise to different variations of success, and that the more successful variations propagate themselves better over time. So overall, on average, in most circumstances, life is getting sort of better and better and better at being what it is, and there's survival of the fittest. But sometimes I think survival of the fittest can also give the wrong impression too. But that sort of idea that things change over time through mechanisms of inheritance, that there is selection of which of these variations are better than others at accomplishing the task that organism needs to accomplish, and that this, inheritance with variation and differential and survivability and fitness gives rise to the diversity of life that we see now, is basically what I mean by evolution. I will also say that the origin of life I view to be a slightly separate but related question, and that one could have lots of different opinions on the origin of the origin of life on the planet Earth and still believe in evolution. If you told me that as a Christian, you believe that God specially seeded Earth with some, kind of bacteria, over 1 billion years ago, and then everything was descended from that, I would say that you're a Christian evolutionist or an evolutionary theist or something like that, even though you have a miracle, right? And if you, or you could believe, some people speculate that life, evolved on some other planet and then got brought here by a meteor. Some people think it evolved in some sort of cosmic soup. There's a lot of growing, speculation that life originated in deep sea vents in the deep sea as a particularly habitable environment for early life. So anyway, like that's a related question to evolution, but it's not what I don't think you need to have a particular answer to that question to count as someone who believes in evolution to me. And I would even say that some amount of people could, like, so I don't know, should we go to Sean's question about the Cambrian explosion, for example?
Well, that's what I was going to say is, there are several things I push back very explicitly on. in my session 11, and one of them was the Cambrian explosion. So in light of what you just shared, I think it would be helpful to differentiate a little bit about what you can do or the moves you can make that an atheistic evolutionist cannot do or cannot make.
Right, right. So so Sean's question is basically like the Cambrian explosion, which for people who may or may not know, around 500-ish million years ago, I forget the exact dates, like 530 million years ago, the fossil record shows a lot of new forms of life that didn't exist before. Prior to 550 million years ago, most life was very simple. There were only probably a few kind of multicellular forms of life, and they were mostly things like sponges or something like that, very simple forms of life. And that after the Cambrian explosion, we get lots of different types of animals, and a lot of those different lineages give rise to the sorts of forms of life that we see now, like cephalopods, which includes like octopuses and squids and that sort of thing. The first vertebrates, the things that kind of have something like a backbone. So everything that has a backbone sort of descended from that period. So we see this huge expansion in the variety of life, and that most of these forms of life don't exist before the Cambrian explosion, or at least we don't have good evidence that they do. And that this Cambrian explosion is something like 10, 20 million years long or something like that, depending on how you define it. So it would seem mathematically implausible, at the very least, to say that all of these new forms of life evolved in such a short time period, and that it seems to test the limits of what you could maybe imagine to be possible over gradual descent to occur in that short period of time. So maybe this suggests that something like, in addition to, neoclassical Darwinism, is required to explain this. So let's imagine, as a Christian evolutionist, I'm like, fine, God was meddling in the system. For some reason, he thought 550 million years ago was a good time to drop some mollusks and some vertebrates and some other sorts of things into the pot that hadn't been there before. And then everything else is descended from there, right? In my mind, I think you're still probably a Christian evolutionist, although, the borderlands between a Christian evolutionist and an intelligent design theorist are kind of blurry.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because,
Mhm.
maybe you could say there would be a hard form of Christian evolutionary theory that would say no miracles, right? Or
Right.
no supernatural events. Maybe I could imagine a Christian taking that tact, right, and still being a Christian. But as a Christian, you don't have the handcuffs that an atheist does,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Like a Christian, at the very least, is going to believe in some miracles, I hope. And so, if there's some miracles at the origin of life, or in the Cambrian explosion, or some other, or maybe you're like, bacterial flagellum, I just really don't think a bacterial flagellum could evolve. Okay, well, that's like 700 or 800 million years ago. Okay, so maybe God dropped a bacterial flagellum, 700 or 800 million years ago, created
Right.
some mollusks and some vertebrates 500 million years ago, but after that, it's been pretty hands off. I mean, you're still going to have all of the difficulties in terms of interpreting Genesis, understanding the uniqueness of humans, reconciling Noah's flood, historical Adam. All of those sorts of questions are still going to be on the table
Right.
if you think that the Cambrian explosion was something of a divinely intervened miracle. I honestly don't know the answer of how to explain how the Cambrian explosion happened. In my current life, I've done mostly, I am a scientist in that I've published scientific papers, but my scientific papers tend to be in the realm of healthcare, not in the realm of, I'm not actually an evolutionary biologist, but I have done a lot of research related to genetics, so I understand genetics fairly well. So when evolutionary biologists talk about genetics, I know what they're talking about
Right.
at the level of, scientific granularity. But I'm not an evolutionary biologist. In fact, most of my most recent papers were about COVID and the vaccines. So if you want like an even more controversial subject to go into, we could talk about that. But so I'm a scientist, but I'm not an evolutionary biologist, is I guess something that I should say. But if I had to guess about the Cambrian explosion, I would say probably something like, I know that prior to the Cambrian explosion, there was a really big ice age, like probably one of the biggest and most intense ice ages that Earth has ever had. in terms of the percentage of Earth that was covered by ice sheets and that sort of thing. So it was a very bad time to be alive. Actually, kind of what happened is that plants got good at photosynthesis, and plants, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then put oxygen back up into the atmosphere, right? And then take the carbon for themselves and start building themselves out of the carbon, right? I'm simplifying a little bit.
Sure.
But plants started getting really good at this. And so they were taking a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And okay, well, in case we need any more controversial subjects, most people often seem to think that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere makes things warmer, right? Because it's a greenhouse gas. So what happens when you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is it makes things colder, right? So there was a giant ice age basically because the plants were too good at being plants and there wasn't a lot of things that could eat plants.
Yep.
Right. And so that created an ice age. And then, I forget exactly why, a volcano or something like that, or, enough things started eating the plants that the ice age started warming up again. Right. And so a lot of the ice went away. And also having a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere is really good for animals, right? Because animals that don't do photosynthesis require oxygen to breathe, right? Basically, and do their metabolism. And so when there's a higher level of oxygen in the atmosphere, it actually makes it easier for animals and actually makes it more difficult for plants. And so I think a warming climate, a greening earth, and a very oxygen-rich environment, and a lot of unclaimed territory, right? There weren't a lot of animals at that time. So there was a very open playing field and very good resources for animal life to flourish. And so I think that was something like a turbocharger on animal evolution for those sorts of reasons. So that would be my best guess as to why the Cambrian explosion shows a lot of diverse forms of animal life kind of all at once, is that there wasn't a lot of competition yet for some of the important places in the environment because there weren't animals there, a good climate and good oxygen. So I would say something like that. And another thing, I was kind of getting caught up on the state of intelligent design in preparation for this, partly from your podcast, but also listening to some of the other people out there like Stephen Mayer and a couple of those people. I'm like, okay, I haven't paid attention to the intelligent design folks, if I'm honest, for a couple decades. So what are they talking about now? I think we've moved on from bacterial flagellum to other things. And so one of the things that they would bring up is that, finding new proteins and stuff like that is extremely improbable, right? Because there's an almost infinite number of protein sequences and a shockingly few number of them are actually useful. When it comes to actually making different forms of animals, you actually oftentimes don't need to invent any new proteins. You just need to put them in. It's like you have all of the Lego blocks, right? You just need to put the Lego blocks in different combinations to figure out new forms of life. And it's not like probably all of the Lego blocks were invented, I'll put that in quotes, by the time of the Cambrian explosion. And it was really just a matter of figuring out different combinations of putting those building blocks in different orders to get different forms of life. So I would say something like there was a pent-up potential that was unleashed by changes in the climate that seems to have caused the Cambrian explosion. I don't know if Sean will find that satisfying or not. But one thing I have to say is, like, if the Cambrian explosion bothers you, you're already admitting that the Earth is very old.
Right.
You're already admitting that the fossil record is more or less reliable, and that the dates that we put on fossils is more or less reliable, and that that there are extremely different kinds of animals back 500 million years ago than there are now, but that they seem like they're the ancestors of things that there are now. So, like, if you're bothered by the Cambrian explosion, I feel like you're already 95% at least of the way towards agreeing with me. So
That's great. Yeah. What do you think too about mutations? Like, one of the things I talked about, and I think Behe's written about it. I'm sure Myers talked about it too. That it looks like, at least in terms of like Lenski's experiment that I talk about with the bacteria, that a lot of the mutations that we can see in real time look like they break things. And like I said, I saw a statistic somewhere, I forget exactly where I saw it, but that 1 out of 1,000 possible mutations are like actually productive, like don't break anything, but actually build something new. Like you're saying, rearranging the Lego blocks in a productive way. Like maybe that happens 1 out of 1,000 times. Do you sort of agree with those statistics? And even if you do agree with those statistics, you know, how does that affect your view of mutations being part of the engine that drives evolution? Like, how do you conceptualize that?
Yeah, I think I'll back up a little bit and go sort of down a different train of thought than people might be expecting. And hopefully this example won't be too hard to understand. In my day job, I mostly do statistics and machine learning and predictive modeling and that sort of thing. Sometimes that relates to science, sometimes it's other sorts of projects. And when you're fitting a complex predictive model, you're an actuary, so
Mhm.
imagine you're trying to build an artificial intelligence model that predicts people's lifespans,
Mhm.
right? That would be something that your life insurance company would want to know about all the people. If they
Yeah.
can more accurately predict people's lifespans and how long they are to outlast the term on their term life insurance, that's a very valuable thing for insurance companies, financial modeling and price setting and those sorts of things.
Yep.
All right, so let's say you've got a model where I give you a medical exam, right? I take your height, your weight, I ask you if you smoke, what conditions you have, give you, look at your cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm trying to, okay, so Will's this 30-something-year-old guy who's mostly healthy, but maybe he has this one, precondition that is not great. Okay, so I'm trying to predict when, how long, what probability Will's going to last to age 70 or something like that. I'm doing that for lots of people. And I haven't done this for life expectancy in particular, but I've done this sorts of projects for Alzheimer's or cancer or some other
Mm.
things like that.
Mhm.
So you have like all of these different variables. Let's say you have like 1,000 different variables, and you're trying to figure out, does this variable increase their life expectancy or decrease their life expectancy, right? Or what about the interaction? Okay, so what if he has diabetes, but what if he also has this, right? Like do these things make it worse together or better together, right? So you have all these different settings that you're trying to find the best combination of to make as good of a predictive model as possible. And one of the most common ways that data scientists or machine learning engineers or whatever you want to call that fit these models is what's called a genetic model or a genetic algorithm, where we basically say, okay, I've got these 1,000 parameters that I need to find the right combination that yields the most accurate model for these 1,000 parameters in combination. And it's such a mathematically complex problem that you could not solve that with algebra, basically, or
Right.
calculus before the universe ends,
Yeah.
right? Because it's such a complex problem. So what do? You say, all right, I'm going to grab one of my 1,000 parameters. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. Okay, did that make my model more accurate or less accurate? Oh, it made it more accurate. Great. I'm going to keep that one. All right, I'm going to now grab a different parameter. I'm going to make it, 5% lower than it was. Oh, that made my model less accurate. Never mind. Discard that change, right? And so you do this something like 1,000,000 times or something like that on a big computer. And after enough tweaking, you arrive at the answer. And what process does that sound familiar to, right? You're basically doing natural selection
Right.
on your input parameters on your artificial intelligence model. And one thing that you often do when you're doing this is you do it 10 different times independently of each other, right? You start them at different points, you run it 10 different times, and see if they all converge on the right answer. And most of the time they do, right? And this is actually way, way faster than trying to solve the problem mathematically. You just solve it randomly and explore the space. And most of the time when you make a change to your model, it makes it worse, right? But
Mhm.
every once in a while in this process, it makes it better. And what's interesting is the closer you are to the answer, the less likely that a change will help, right? Because you're already pretty close, right?
Right.
And so, but in the beginning, when you're further away from the answer, it's more likely that one of your changes will improve your model, right? So it gets more accurate more quickly in the beginning, and then sort of levels out in accuracy, and then at some point you say it's close enough, right?
Mhm.
And this is actually very, very similar. And that's actually part of my answer to the Cambrian explosion, right? There were all of these unsolved problems in biology space.
Right.
You can be a vertebrate, you can be a predator, you can be a herbivore, right? There are all of these untapped resources. And so it starts evolving really quickly in the beginning, because if you're relatively far away from the answer, but there's a lot of energy available, you'll evolve quickly until you sort of stabilize into the correct answer. So I actually don't find so let's say 1 out of 1,000 mutations are beneficial. That sounds about right to me. That's kind of similar to when you're doing this machine learning thing. It's,
Mhm.
maybe a little bit better than that in machine learning land, but yet the algorithm converges and it's actually the fastest, most computationally efficient way to solve an incredibly complex problem. And
Mhm.
I actually wonder if some of those intelligent design people have worked with genetic algorithms in terms of machine learning, because it actually, so anyway, I hope, I wonder if that example, maybe that was just sounded like
No,
gobbledygook, but
no, I think that that makes sense. It certainly makes sense to me. We use, like you said, some of the same technology in the actuarial space, which is where I've been for the last 7+ years. But yeah, the idea that that you could have things that go wrong and then they get wiped out pretty quickly and then they go right and then things move ahead. I think one of my questions, I think it was one of Sean's questions on that too, is, and I don't know what you think about this, but in those kind of situations, like imagine you have like a an animal that does have like a good mutation, like it sort of wins the jackpot, um, and then it has to breed, right? It has to pass along that information. Does it have to find another of that species with the same mutation, or can the mutation live on even if it's just in the one on the one side, or how does that
it
work?
depends, it depends the nature of the mutation, right? There's what could be a mutation in a single nucleotide, right? A single letter, right,
Right.
in your code.
Hmm.
Like imagine the first human to have blue eyes, right?
Hmm.
Blue eyes are just one letter different in your genetic code from brown eyes, right? And so presumably there was a bunch of brown-eyed people, someone had the first blue-eyed mutation. Blue eyes are actually recessive, so it takes getting a blue eye from both parents to have blue eyes. So the first person to have the mutation actually was still had brown eyes, but eventually that gene finds itself again, probably kind of through incest, and or at least being related to that same person twice. That's actually part of the reason why incest is bad, is because negative mutations that are recessive can find each other again and then express the bad thing, right?
Right.
So that blue eye found each other and all of a sudden a kid has blue eyes, right? It actually, you needed both parents to have the gene for it to be expressed, but for a long time brown-eyed and blue-eyed people can have babies together. I think that most people are aware of this phenomenon, right? Okay, so for mutations like that, it doesn't require both parents to be on the same page. But some mutations are more severe than that. There are like chromosomal things. Like people might be aware of Down syndrome, right? As a, basically there was a problem. Chromosomes are sort of like the books of the genetic code, right? Like your Bible is your whole genetic code, but it's broken up into different books, right? And so you get a copy of each book from each parent, and there needs to be the same number of books, right? And you need one book from each parent. But the problem with something like Down syndrome is that you get 2 copies of the same book from one parent and 1 copy from another parent, and that can have bad problems. Now, another thing that can happen is a book can break in half, right? Such that you now have more chromosomes than your parent had. And that you can survive like that, but you will not be able to reproduce unless you find someone who has the
Mm.
exact same break. So
Okay.
often what I think happens, and this is very rare, but you can imagine, like I like fishing, so there's muskies and northern pike both live in northern Wisconsin, and they're pretty similar fish, right? I think most fishermen would not be surprised to learn that muskies and northern pike are pretty closely related, and they can breed together and they make a hybrid called a tiger muskie. But the tiger muskie is infertile, right?
Right.
Many hybrids between 2 species are infertile, and that's often because there's a chromosome count problem, right? I forget whether it's muskies or northern pike have one more chromosome than the other, but presumably at some point there was just northern pike, and all of a sudden some poor muskie gets some chromosome thing where one of his books gets split in half, right? But if, like, you can imagine that if that happened to, like, twins or something like that, although the twins would have to be a different gender, but every once in a very blue moon, right, you could imagine that 2 animals at the same time have the same problem.
Right.
Probably they're siblings, though. and then they can find each other, and they can only reproduce with each other, and they can't reproduce, like the new muskies that got this weird chromosome split in half thing. They can find each other, and all of a sudden they can only reproduce with each other. They can't reproduce with northern pikes again. So then they're their own new species, and they have to find their new evolutionary path. And for muskies, it was to get even bigger than northern pikes, so that they could eat, even bigger fish, and sometimes even eat the northern pikes themselves, right? They had to find a new niche for themselves. They couldn't just be a northern pike anymore. Those sorts of things are very rare events, but they do seem to happen every once in a while. But extremely rare events have a disproportionate impact on the course of life history. So hopefully that helps answer Sean's question. So it's extremely rare, that would happen. Like, every once in a while, mules are a hybrid between a donkey and a horse, right? And most of the time they're infertile. Every once in a very, very blue moon, a mule can get pregnant if it finds a donkey or a horse that had the same genetic problem. And there are some recorded events of mules having mule babies from with a parent that was either a donkey or horse that had the same genetic problem. So then you can imagine, then you get into a situation where we can get fertile mules that then are their own new species that have to figure out their own, niche to inhabit in the environment.
Right. Yep. That's
you only need, if it's once in a billion, it happens every once in a while. The odds of winning the lottery are 1 in a billion, but yet someone wins the lottery, right? And so those sorts of things can happen.
Yeah, and again, we're talking about long periods of time here and quick cycles, especially with, you're using a lot of examples that are easier for people to picture because they're more modern, larger animals. But we can imagine with things like bacteria, especially early on, or even smaller, sponges and things like that, that things would happen faster, than what we
and
can
it's only a
imagine.
problem for sexually reproducing animals.
Sure,
for animals like bacteria that just make copies of themselves through mitosis, that don't need mommies and daddies to make babies, right? That's it's not actually even a problem, right? If they mess up in that particular way.
Absolutely. Have you had a chance to, you mentioned Behe a couple times earlier, like you were sort of a Behe follower at one point, and then now it sounds like maybe you would think about things a little bit differently with Behe. What do you think about Darwin's Black Box? We're almost 30 years out from when he originally wrote it. What do you think of that? The ideas that he presents there about irreducibly complex systems, and then again, is there a difference between what you can do with what an atheist would have to do?
Right. I mean, I think that a lot of times the main motivation of the intelligent design movement was to find something that couldn't be naturally explained. Right. And then all of a sudden, then you all of a sudden find a death blow to atheism. Right. But for a Christian, evolutionist, like, okay, great, add a new miracle to the list. I'm fine with miracles. Right. And that's why I'm saying that the line is blurry. But oftentimes, like I said, most of those intelligent design theorists believe with the evolutionary biologist 99.9% of the time. Right. So it's actually, in my opinion, still kind of in the evolutionary camp, because they still will probably believe in common descent and still believe that humans and monkeys are relatives and those sorts of things. And so I don't view that as like, necessarily that different from me. But I think that there is sort of like an energy in intelligent design theory that's sort of like evolution is almost like a conspiracy against Christianity. Right. And that the evolutionary biologists are over there, and we, the intelligent design people, are over here, when really I don't think that evolutionary science is a grand conspiracy meant to debunk Christianity, right? I've known too many scientists. I've been, if there's a secret cabal, I've been in their meeting rooms, and they weren't talking about what you think they're talking about, right? As far as I can tell, there are no secret meetings of all the evolutionary biologists. We're like, how can we make Christianity seem less plausible this week, guys? I don't think that those meetings exist, and I really think that the intelligent design people, because they're so highly motivated to find problems with evolution, would actually make great evolutionary biologists. And that the best way to be a new scientist is find a problem with the current theory, and then find some ways to conduct experiments that expose that problem, and then try and propose amendments to or new theories that can account for those anomalies and move forward, right? So I sometimes feel like there's a weird motivation in the intelligent design crowd that's sort of the mirror image of what they imagine the evolutionary biologists are doing, right? They're actually conspiring to undermine atheism because they imagine the atheists are conspiring to undermine Christianity.
Right.
And really, I think that if the intelligent design people have good ideas, they should just be scientists, right? And some of them I think are better at that than others. I'll say that. But I think part of my motivation is that I want to break down this idea that evolution is this thing that's, diametrically opposed to Christianity, that needs to be resisted, and that's sort of one coherent unifying force that's out to get your faith or something like that.
Right.
And I think that intelligent design feeds into that idea more than I think is accurate or healthy.
Yeah, no, I think the same thing's true with like the Big Bang Theory. We talked about it. I talked about it with Sean on multiple occasions where, I grew up in an environment where even though we were old Earth, we had this view of the Big Bang, that we had like a negative view of the term Big Bang. The term Big Bang was coined by a Roman Catholic priest who is also a professional astronomer. So like, it's not like, the enemy.
And he thought he was supporting Christianity by doing so.
It's not like the enemy came up with the Big Bang. And yet, I'll have conversations like I had a conversation with atheist skeptic Tom Jump, and he claimed, and I didn't push back on it in the interview, but he claimed that the scientific consensus now is in these multiverse views. And look, like, you want to go that direction, that's fine, but that's a religion just as much as Christianity is religion. Like, we will never be able to observe any of those additional universes, like, period. And so I do agree that even in physics, there are these additional ideas that get added to whatever theories in vogue, which right now Big Bang's in vogue. And so you have to add on things to be an atheist scientist and to do the work that you can do and to ignore miracles and to shove all that stuff aside. And so what I'm hearing you saying repeatedly is that evolutionary biologists do the same thing, that they add things to the theory that would make it, not taste so good to a Christian, but that when you strip away all the veneer underneath, the science that's underneath actually can support
yes.
Or at least
and
not
I actually
oppose Christianity.
Yeah, and I think that there are actually some very real problems for trying to be an atheist and an evolutionary theory supporter at the same time that don't pose a problem for a Christian. So in other words, I actually think it's easier to believe in evolution as a Christian than it is as an atheist. And so, and one of the reasons that I would give for that is that if you believe in evolution, then you believe that our minds are the product of evolution, and you believe that evolution only cares about behavior, right? Evolution doesn't care what ideas you're communicating inside your head. It just cares about how you act. And if you act in a way that's that provides greater fitness, good. If you don't, bad, right? Evolution doesn't care about, what you believe inside your head. It just cares about how you act. And so evolution would therefore have designed us to act optimally for whatever purpose and whatever niche we're filling in our environment, etc. And so you, as an atheist, would have no reason to believe that our minds evolved to believe true propositions. We just evolved to have impulses that caused us to act well. And so unless you have an a priori reason, which biology cannot give you, that truth about the universe and good behavior are in the same direction, then you cannot believe that you evolved through the process of evolution to correctly understand the process of evolution. Right. I tried to put that succinctly. Alvin Plantinga, who's a Calvinist philosopher, we'll forgive him for his Calvinism, but he's a pretty great guy otherwise, there's what's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And so I'm just trying to paraphrase that. And I will say the one time Jordan Peterson retweeted me was when I was explaining the evolutionary argument against naturalism. So that my claim to fame is explaining that one time that got retweeted and viewed by 40,000 people or something like that. But anyway, this is actually an argument that I actually think is pretty powerful. A Christian can say, we believe that God created reason. right? And that the universe is, the sort of place where true behavior and true beliefs are in accord because a wise God created everything and the earth is full of his wisdom, or something like that, to give a reason. But it's a theological reason, and it is not a scientific reason. And without a theological reason for believing that the universe is the sort of good place that would cause you to believe true things, because true things being in your head and true things coming out of your actions are in accordance with each other, unless you have an a priori reason for that, you cannot actually think that you would evolve to understand the theory of evolution correctly. So I actually think that that's an interesting point, is that it's actually seemingly easier to be a Christian evolutionist than an atheistic evolutionist. And that's something that's not widely known, even though that argument is actually still very popular in philosophical circles. There's been attempts to refute it, and then the argument gets made a little bit differently to make it stronger again and stuff like that. I won't go into all that detail, but it's still a very widely respected philosophical argument in the philosophical community. The biology community doesn't seem to have learned this, but the philosophy of science community does. And I think that there's another problem with evolution for a atheist that's also kind of interesting. The way that evolution often gets explained, right, is, I sort of explained this earlier, animals can vary in how fit they are to their environment. Fitness gives you better odds of survival and better ability to produce offspring, okay, and those changes then get passed on and generations evolve, right, etc. Okay, but what does fitness to your environment mean? Can I measure that, right? If I asked you as a physicist to measure the force of gravity, you can do that, right? Yeah. If I ask an evolutionary biologist, can you give me a score on how fit that organism is over there? They can't, right? Fitness is it's like, we understand what it means when we talk about it, but it's not a very scientifically defined concept. And I would say it's not scientifically defined at all. One way that you can scientifically define it is, well, they will survive longer and have more offspring. But then all you're saying is the animals that survive longer and have more offspring survive longer and have more offspring.
It's circular, right? Yeah.
It's a tautology. It's a meaningless statement. It's the same thing as saying what will be, right? And in which case, okay, great. Congratulations, evolutionary biologists. What will be. Yeah, that's by definition true, but it's meaningless. And that I think that the only way to escape from this, and it's called the tautology problem in evolution. The only way to escape from this is to give some sort of definition of fitness that I think relies on purpose as your explanation, right? It is better at achieving its purpose. That polar bear is more fit than that polar bear because it is closer to what a polar bear needs to be the ideal version of a polar bear, which is something that eats seals, can survive in extremely cold temperatures, and has babies in a den in the winter, and all the sorts of things that there's like an ideal polar bear, and the ideal polar bear is perfectly good at accomplishing the purposes of a polar bear, and there are degrees of shades of difference between a good one and a bad one, right? And all of a sudden you're talking about something that's you're talking about a metaphysical polar bear, right? And you're talking about purpose. And so I think this idea, a lot of people get told that evolution means that life is purposeless, or that the universe is purposeless. I think that is the most hilariously inaccurate way of making sense of the theory of evolution that I could imagine. The only way that the theory of evolution makes any intelligible sense if the whole thing is about purpose, right? Whenever an evolutionary biologist, why are polar bears white? They're white for the purpose of hiding in their environment from their prey. Purpose. Why do they have really long teeth? Well, they have long teeth for the purpose of biting into seal skins, right? Why do they hibernate in the winter? Because they live in the Arctic and it's really cold and it's dark all winter, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Purpose. And actually, one thing that I think is interesting about evolutionary biology, in physics, you guys don't talk about the purpose of things, right? You just talk about laws and how things move, right? And the rules and patterns that govern force and matter and the interaction between those two things. Purpose never enters the discussion, right? But in evolutionary biology, the only way you can talk sensibly about evolutionary biology is to talk about purpose constantly. You're talking about the purpose of things all the time. And like I said, the only way that you can define the theory of evolution in a way that isn't just a nonsensical tautology is to talk with purpose. And so the idea that evolutionary biology shows that the universe is purposeless is just so 180 degrees wrong-headed that I don't know what to say. So I actually feel like it supports the idea that the universe is a place that's full of purpose and is constantly trying to reveal and live up to the purpose. And okay, so where does purpose come from? You can even do your Thomas Aquinas style, teleological argument in a very different sort of way. Well, purpose must come from the highest thing that gives purpose to everything else. And so I actually feel like it's much more supportive of a Christian worldview than an atheistic worldview.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think that's really important for people to know too. Before we close out, I do want to get some ideas on Genesis 1 and 2 and how you interpret them, because in the class, I talk about 8 different ways of looking at the scripture, and obviously you're not a young Earth creationist. You're probably not in the gap camp anymore. So are you with Francis Collins? Do you like his sort of like a non-literal, like throw up your hands, Genesis 1 and 2 are different, so we don't have to interpret it literally? Do you like Walton better? Do you have more of a vague, non-literal approach? Or sort of how do you look at Genesis 1 and 2?
I do think that a lot, and so it's not just Genesis 1, 2, and 3 that are a problem. Noah's Ark is an equally, it's
Sure,
actually,
yeah.
Noah's Ark is an even bigger problem
Yeah.
than the earlier chapters, because the earlier chapters, as you pointed out, have a fair amount of wiggle room,
Yeah.
and how even you could attempt to interpret them literally, right?
Mhm.
But Noah's Ark, some people maybe go for a regional explanation of Noah's Ark, but I actually don't think that is very convincing in either a literal or a non-literal sense. But in any case, so multiple chapters and multiple stories within, and the Tower of Babel. Okay, the linguists aren't very convinced that all of a sudden, somewhere in Babylon, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, all of the languages just, appeared and were
Right.
randomly different from each other. That's not a
Right.
very, the history of linguistic people also don't find that story very convincing. All right, so we've got problems with the 6-day creation. We've got problems with Adam and Eve in the garden. We've got problems with the Tower of Babel. We've got problems with Noah's Ark. Although I would say, maybe starting with like Abraham, I would say that then sort of there aren't really any problems from there, right?
Yeah.
If you want to interpret it as something like literal history. There's actually even a very recent archaeological discovery about a comet that seems to have crashed into right where Sodom and Gomorrah were, right around the same time that that's supposed to have happened. So there's actually pretty good archaeological evidence for that particular, for fire and brimstone literally raining down from heaven. But in terms of the earlier stories, I do go a non-literal route, and I do really want to say that in all of this, I want to preserve the idea of the Bible as the authoritative word of God, and to not be trying to belittle scripture in any sense, but to be seeking what it means for it to be true and what God is trying to teach us through the scriptures. I'm absolutely committed to that, right?
Mhm.
And so I know that there are a lot of people who are sort of literal or bust
Right. Sure.
when it comes to those sorts of things. And if you're non-literal, you're not taking authoritatively. I fear that the problems with that is that you'll get too many people who opt for bust if you make the dichotomy to be that.
Agreed.
And
Yeah.
that when you look at early Christianity, I have a series on my YouTube channels going through the church fathers. Most of the time when they're talking about interpreting Genesis, they do it in some sort of allegorical, symbolic, or you could say spiritual or heavenly way of interpreting it. Like the Apostle Paul does this when he's talking about in Galatians, when he's talking about Sarah being representative of one covenant and Hagar being representative of another covenant. He is interpreting the book of Genesis in he literally uses the word allegory, right? When he's talking about Sarah and Hagar are an allegory for the different covenants and
Correct.
the child of promise and the child,
Yeah.
like that sort of thing. So the idea that you can interpret Genesis allegorically is in the New Testament itself. And that's not the only example. It's just perhaps the most obvious example. So I think that I'm not going to say I don't have time, and also I don't want to make people too angry by giving my own possible sort of spiritual or heavenly interpretation of what Genesis is talking about. But I do think that when you've got trees that are of life or of the knowledge of good and evil, and you have talking snakes, and you have Adam whose name means man, right? And you have Eden that means like fertility, right? Like all of the words are at such like a archetypal and symbolically resonant level, that to me, it seems not just prudent, but it seems like the best option to say that these are dealing with deeper truths than can be communicated in a purely literal sense. And that it seems to me like, if you, in the last couple of days, I was reading some Babylonian myths in possible preparation for this conversation. I think that when we hear the word myth, we hear story that's made up, right? But I actually think that mythology and spiritually loaded and revelatory narrative is actually one of the most important forms of communicating deep truths that there are. And that the truths that are being communicated by Genesis, the early stories, there's one God, he made the world, he did it intentionally. It wasn't because two gods got in a fight and the innards of one of the gods became the earth or something like that, which are other possible things, nor is it that there was an evil God that was in rebellion against a good God, or, that all of creation was made good. The tree of life, I don't know, it's something like, maybe it's like our relationship to God's everlasting life, right? And that because of human, man's sin, Adam's sin, man's sin, we are separated from that. I think that there are good reasons to believe that Genesis, especially the early parts, are written in a specifically non-literal way. And to insist on their literality, if that's a word, is actually to lead you further away from the proper interpretation of them than the better interpretation. And I don't know, it's hard to make that point to people who are very used to a literal or bust sort of approach. But, John Walton's interesting. I would say that John Walton, sometimes I find him that he isolates us from the text too much, right? He's so much about in interpreting it in its own world that's like, okay, I don't live in that lost world anymore, John
Right.
Walton. So is that just irrelevant, right? So I feel like he's not the best at that. I feel like Tim Mackey of the Bible Project actually does a pretty good job of giving allegorical interpretations, although he does not say that that's what he's doing, but that is what he's doing. When you listen to him talk about the early Genesis stories, Jonathan Pageau is an Eastern Orthodox icon carver that I actually sort of enjoy. He does a good job of modern day interpretation. And I actually even kind of like Jordan Peterson's, listen to Jordan Peterson's lectures on Genesis and ask yourself if there aren't more interesting ways to interpret these things. I'm not saying agree with Jordan Peterson about everything, because he's not even particularly Christian, but I think that he would be a good way for a lot of people to open their minds on these sorts of subjects. And I think that one of the reasons why people like Jordan Peterson and others have had a big impact on a lot of people coming back to faith is that there were a lot of people in the literal or bust camp, and that then decided to go with bust and that the Bible's irrelevant and it doesn't mean anything. But when you start to allow for allegorical or spiritual or heavenly interpretation, then I think a lot of people find that interesting again, and that he's gotten a lot of people excited about the Bible again who weren't for a while. And I think it's precisely because he offers a compelling and interesting non-literal way to look at it. And so, and like I've said, lots of church fathers are in the non-literal camp. It's not like all of a sudden, because of the theory of evolution, Christians started interpreting non-literally. Origen himself also thought that up until Abraham, the early parts of Genesis were non-literal. And he's saying that in the early 200s AD, right? So, this isn't a new idea. If you read, in fact, almost any church father will give you a non-literal interpretation of Genesis. So I think that our modern world has fallen into the trap that atheists have laid for us, that only material explanations, only physical explanations of things matter. And so if Genesis isn't doing that, then it's irrelevant or wrong or stupid. And so then we've said, oh, it is doing that, but here's why it's actually right, or something like that. And I actually think that impulse is mistaken. I think the right answer is to not fall into that trap and say that spiritual communication in the form of mythological narrative is actually way more important than us modern people often realize. And I think trees of life, trees of this, mythological figures going through a narrative is actually speaking in a very deep and powerful way that we modern people belittle, and we belittle it to our own error. So that would be my response to that.
I think it's all fair. I mean, I think there is a how, what does it mean to be literal? What does it mean to literally interpret Genesis 1? Does it mean
Yeah,
literally interpret it like we can read through it in modern English translations in our modern Western world and just decide that whatever it sounds like to me most literally is the literal way to read it? That's where
right.
we
Like
get
a
a lot
lot
of
of literal
things.
people will think that there was no animal death before the fall, and then
Right,
afterwards there was animal death. It
right.
does not literally say that. That
No.
is from Augustine's own allegorical interpretation, right? And I think what most people think that they base in Genesis is actually allegorical interpretation from people like Augustine or John Milton or whoever,
Right,
that they project back into the text, and they think that's the literal layer, but it's actually an allegorical spiritual layer that they've confused for a literal layer and don't know where those ideas are coming from, and they're not explicitly there in the text. And again,
right,
I'm not against allegorical interpretations, just be honest about what you're doing,
right,
right? And know where you're getting your ideas from.
right.
And a lot of people, even X-way people, a lot of their ideas about Genesis are actually Augustinian
Mhm.
in their origins and not explicitly there on the surface level reading of Genesis itself.
Right, sure. One last question, just to push back a little bit at your allegorical way of looking at Genesis. So, as someone who agrees with you, who thinks that this is a possible solution to the problem, I've got no defenses up from that sort of perspective. What holds someone like me back, and I don't know, I won't speak for Sean, but maybe it keeps Sean back too, people like Sean or other friends that we have, is this idea of how far can we push typology? Like Jesus, for example, and Paul seem to talk about Noah, seem to talk about Adam as if they're literal historical figures. Peter seems to do the same thing. And so I don't have a problem with an allegorical, answer to some of these questions, but where I'm going to push back is when we see these things getting mentioned in the New Testament, it seems like they're historical. It seems like they're historical characters. What do you say to someone who presents you with that kind of a problem?
Sure. No, I should say I sincerely respect that objection, and I've wrestled with that one and still kind of wrestle with it myself. But I'll do something like my best. You can also hear Origin talk when he talks about Adam or Noah. He kind of just talks about them just straight, the same
Mhm.
sort of way that it seems like John or Jesus and Paul do.
Right.
But
Yeah.
then when you read what Origin actually thinks, he thinks that they're mythological symbolic characters,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And so just because sometimes when you talk about them, like I could talk about it too in a way that would make it seem like I thought that they were historical characters. Like I could say we should all be like the Good Samaritan, right? The Good Samaritan, he was kind to the person on the road, and those priests and those Pharisees were not. So we should remember the example of the Good Samaritan when we encounter strangers and help. Oh, by the way, the Samaritan man, he didn't exist. That was a parable that
You
Jesus
sound like a
told,
pastor on a
right?
Sunday. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so do I, like in that short little snippet where I was talking about the Samaritan man, right? It sounds like I mean it in a literal historical sense, even though I will quickly tell you that that's actually not what I mean. So, and also a lot of times, like in Second Peter, I think it is, the flood story is brought up as a typological allegory
Mhm.
for the judgment of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
and just as in the same way that Noah built something with wood and nails that saved the whole world, right? In the same way, Jesus with wood and nails saves the whole world, like that sort of thing, and
Yeah.
saves them. They were judged by water. We're going to be judged by fire, right? That typology is actually how Peter talks about the flood story.
Mhm.
And so I would say something like this, are we washed clean by the blood of Jesus Christ? Yes. Okay, what does that mean? Is the blood of Jesus Christ an antiseptic that kills unclean bacteria on your skin? Well, no, right? Okay, have we been filled with the Holy Spirit? Yes. Okay, if I slice you open, will I see the Holy Spirit inside you? Well, no, no. All right, have you accepted Jesus into your heart? Should you tell your cardiac surgeon that you've accepted Jesus into your heart before you get open heart surgery so he knows which ventricle not to cut Jesus in? Right. Well,
Right.
no, no, no. Okay. Right. Actually, a lot of our language is what I would call, when a lot of biblical language is what I would call it, a theological or a spiritual level,
Mhm.
right? Jesus died for our sins, and we have, whatever pick your atonement theory here, right? Jesus's death, atonement happens, right? Okay, but all of those explanations are non-physical, right? There wasn't some. It's not like Jesus performed some procedure, medical procedure on your brain to get sin out of you or something like that. We're talking at the level of symbols and theology and spiritual, logic or something like that. And I think that a lot of the early Genesis is setting up and even kind of laying the foundation for the spiritual logic, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, of the whole New Testament, right? Like, okay, there's light and darkness, there's being obedient to God, there's being disobedient to God, right? There's God's judgment, there's God's promises, right? All
There's
of these sorts of
persistence through crazy, obstacles and pushback, and
right.
yeah.
And there are agents like a talking snake who are trying to deceive you and lead you away from God. And there's the tree of life which gives you immortality. There's immortality from closeness to God. There's the knowledge of good and evil, right? All of these things it's something like the theological ontology of the spiritual logic of all of Scripture sort of gets introduced and laid out in these early pages. And that everything else is sort of like repeating that, playing with that, showing how these things work together, and that all of it comes together in Christ. But the centurions who didn't, or the Jews who didn't believe in Christ, they saw the same physical event that the Christians did, but they didn't understand what it meant, right? And what it means is at the level of theology and spiritual truth, right? Some people could see it, and even a lot of the apostles didn't understand it at first, but then they see it, even though they witnessed the same physical event. So I'm not saying that the physical event isn't important, but it can lend itself to different interpretations or misunderstandings, right? And so it's actually that spiritual interpretation and understanding of the truth of the matter that's actually the real importance of what happened to Jesus on the cross. And I would say that sort of spiritual understanding for making sense of Jesus and everything is laid out in Genesis, and it's done at the level of spiritual, mythological narrative. And I don't mean mythology in a negative sense. I actually mean it in a very positive sense, even though we don't tend to use it that way very much. So I think all that to say, I think it's totally fine to talk about Adam, to talk about Noah, to talk about Cain and Abel, to talk about the Tower of Babel in a way that is revealing something deeply, deeply true. So true that we almost can't even imagine how true it really is, because we could only think true thoughts because of it, right? Without it needing to be the recordings of a physical event that transpired that we could have watched with a video camera or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, fascinating. Well, thanks so much for your time, Sam. I think this will be a good amount of material to get out to the Restitutio fans, and we'll see what Sean says, and maybe we can have another discussion at some point about specific
Sean reacting to all of the softball questions that you lobbed to me, and
that's
and
right.
not giving me any of the hard pitches that he had wanted to pitch.
That's right. So. Yeah, the Adam and Eve, really pushing on the Adam and Eve and the fall of man, and all of those hard questions that we almost got to, but ran out of time for. So we'll see what he says. But thanks so much, Sam. I really appreciate this conversation.
Well, thank you, Will. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you, like I mentioned at the beginning, for the work that you're doing. I really want this to be a subject that Christians can disagree about in charity. And
Absolutely.
That is not a reason for disfellowshipping or that sort of thing. And in all of this, I mean to strengthen faith. I mean to strengthen our understanding of the Bible and our faith in its authority and God-given source. And I hope I'm not here to undermine anyone's faith. And I am, if anything, I'm here to prevent others from doing that to people who might be susceptible to it if they hadn't thought these things. And I've had to go through this process for like 20 years to even I feel like pick up some of the pieces that got thrown apart at me when I was 18 or 19 years old. So hopefully other people don't need to go through that same experience, because it wasn't always very fun or easy.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel about it too, is, if we can do something for this next generation of 17, 18, 19-year-olds, then that's great, or future generations of those young people, because, the mainstream Christian rhetoric on it is not good. The mainstream scientific rhetoric on it is not good. There aren't a lot of these conversations going on where people are charitable and are open to multiple interpretations. So it's really important that we open up that space and make that space available. And I think we've done a small little bit of that today, I think. So thankful for that.
I hope so. All right. Well, thank you, Will. I appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Thanks, Sam.